Well, good evening. Welcome to Drinks and Dialogue. I am Carla. This
And
is
I'm
Grace.
Grace. Yep.
And this is our very first guest at Drinks and Dialogue, Markham Hislop.
Thank you very much for having me, ladies.
You're quite welcome. Now, the reason why we invited Markham is, in addition to, him just being a great guy to chat with.
Oh.
Markham is an energy journalist and energy transition expert at Energy Media. He has spent the last decade reporting on clean energy technology adoption, which is the foundation of the global energy transition. His YouTube channel is dedicated to providing insightful journalism, strategic advocacy, and community engagement that empowers Albertans to embrace a new energy future. And I will make sure that your YouTube channel is linked within the description so that you can find him.
Excellent.
Now, today, last video, we did housing, comparing the platforms of conservatives and the liberals. And this time we want to do energy.
Can I put in a little plug here?
Absolutely.
When you go to our YouTube channel, you'll find 3 months ago, we launched the Energy Show, ENERGI, which is meant to be a daily video news program. So it's about stories that are in the news cycle still. And we converted our podcast, which we've had since 2022, but is now on video in a separate playlist, Energy Talks, into kind of those long, nerdy, more technical kind of things, so if you want the stuff that's not in the news cycle, Energy Talks. If you want stuff that's in the news cycle, the last day or two, then it's the Energy Show.
I'm thinking that Energy Show probably kind of is about my level, because whenever I watch your videos, Markham, I feel extremely dumb. I do not know much about energy. I know a lot about housing, but not energy. So we kind of had decided that in order to kind of start this out, and because Markham is the one with all the knowledge, Markham, if you had to design a platform for a brand new federal political party, and it had the best energy platform available, what would be in it, and what would it look like?
Let me provide a little context for this conversation. So it wasn't a few months ago that Fatih Birol, who's the executive director of the International Energy Agency, said, "The age of oil is dead. The age of electricity is beginning." So what he means is that electric technologies, and we're talking here about solar panels that got first introduced in 1979, wind turbines in the 1980s, lithium-ion batteries in the first commercial EVs in the 1990s. All of those technologies have been in development in the marketplace, but first they weren't competitive now, and they became gradually more so over time. Around 2020, they all reached their inflection point, which means basically that they reach the point at which they're competitive with oil and gas technologies that are already been around for 100 years. So and they're still developing. They're still falling in cost. For instance, solar plus battery storage is now as cheap or cheaper than a new natural gas plant in many parts of the world. It's cheaper or the same as coal. So very, very, very competitive, and costs are falling yet and will continue probably for another decade or more. So the moral of the story here is that the global economy is gradually electrifying. Now, this is not a light switch moment. It's going to take us, decades to get this all done. But the process is beginning. And that's what Birol was referring to, the age of electricity. So if we assume that that's correct, then what I would do for the Canadian economy is the first thing I would do is what, in fact, Mark Carney for the Liberals announced here earlier this week, is a national power grid. Because under the Canadian Constitution, energy is a provincial responsibility. And so we have like 10 little power grids. And if you count the territories, 3 more little power grids. And they don't talk to each other very much. If there's any electricity trading, most of it goes north and south, particularly with the big hydro provinces, BC, Manitoba, and Quebec. And then Ontario has nuclear. So Um, but the first thing that we want to do is to be able to trade electricity east and west rather than north and south. And the reason for that is that intermittence, wind and solar, work really well together with hydro. Hydro dams act like a big battery. So when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining, and you have this flood amazingly cheap electricity. Like in Alberta, where you actually have the only wholesale market in Canada, when the renewables hit, they basically drive the cost of electricity down to zero. I mean, that's how cheap it is. So when that happens, everybody wants to use that, and so you put as much of that electricity into the grid as you can, and you share it amongst the provinces in some way. And when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, then all that water that backed up behind the hydro dams in the reservoirs, you let that through, and you produce as much electricity as you can with the hydro dams, and you send that electricity out into the power grid, and then all four provinces can get as much power as they need. That's the general principle. It's a lot more complicated in practice, but that's the general principle. Why you want to trade east and west. So you could see with Ontario being right next to Quebec, perfect. Trade electricity between those two provinces. Trade electricity between Quebec and the Maritime province. So you might actually have, at the end of the day, three power grids: a Western, a Central, and the Atlantic Loop. So that would be the first thing. And I've interviewed energy modelers like Dr. Chris Patai, who've told me that for advanced economies like Canada, they'll probably need two to three times more electricity by 2050 than we currently generate. And emerging economies will require 3 to 5 times more generation than they currently have. So we're moving away from fossil fuels, which are relatively inefficient, to electricity, which is quite a bit more efficient, like double or triple as efficient, which then over time lowers costs. Okay, so that's the start. That's the number one thing I do. The second thing I would do is, because like the International Energy Agency is modeling that in 2030 oil and gas demand is going to peak, and then depending what happens after depends on a whole variety of factors. It could plateau for a long time. It could start declining fairly rapidly in like the mid 20, like 2033 or something, or it could decline immediately. Those are the kind of the three scenarios that the IEA has got. So if the IEA is correct, then Alberta needs to look ahead and say, holy crap, 5 years from now, the demand for our major product, oil, is going to peak, and then it's going to start to decline. Prices usually fall when there's more supply than there is demand. That's not good for us. So we need to do something else with this. And Alberta is so fortunate because it has 170 billion barrels of bitumen up in the oil sands that can be recovered. And bitumen is an amazing molecule, a molecular structure. It's like a sheet of hydrogen and carbon atoms, along with some other atoms. Anyway, I've interviewed the chemists, the chemical engineers at Alberta Innovates, the agency that leads the research into bitumen beyond combustion, and they say that that sheet structure enables bitumen to be turned into materials. So in 2017, they started this process in research into a process that would turn bitumen into carbon fiber precursor, which you then sell to a company that makes carbon fiber. And they're about a year away from having that commercially ready, a year-ish, but very, 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 very close. And if you turn, Alberta Innovates modeled this, did the economic modeling, and they said, let's say you got $50 a barrel from selling bitumen to a refinery down in the U.S. If you got $50 for that, you turn it into carbon fiber, you get $200. If you turn it into asphalt binder, which you use to make roads, it's $100. You turn it into activated carbon, which is what you use in batteries and other products, it's $120. The lowest value thing that Alberta can do with a barrel of bitumen is burn it, is turn it down and turn it into fuel. So given that that's the case, One of the things that I would do is we need to start talking about today about how down the road we need to begin to pivot, because oil's not going away for a while. So you need to pivot and then take 10 or 20 years to build up this industry so that we have a domestic market instead of sending it off to the United States. That's also a terrific response to Donald Trump, right? He's threatened to put tariffs on oil and gas. He's threatened Canada and its exports. So why not create a domestic market, keep it in-house, create the advanced materials manufacturing plants and supply chains here, employ people here, create business opportunities here, rather than letting the Americans add value to our product by shipping it down to their refineries. So the combination of electrifying the economy and building out the power, and if I can't remember if I mentioned this earlier, but Canada has one of the best grids in the world. It's 84% clean, low cost, cheap, low cost and reliable. So it's a huge competitive advantage as we begin to electrify.
Right.
So use that and then
Right.
begin to use oil and gas
Right.
as feedstock for materials. And Alberta already has a big advantage because it's got the second largest petrochemical cluster in North America. So big head start, work with the strengths that you've got, build on that with the technology that the Alberta government actually owns the intellectual property on. And that's the foundation for prosperity in this new economy after 2030 as we begin to pivot into this electric future.
Wow. That's a lot. And that's amazing. That's absolutely amazing.
Well, here's the thing, Grace. I've been talking about this for a long time. In fact, Carla, do you remember in 2019 when my book came out, The New Alberta Advantage, Technology Policy and Future of the Oil Sands, you very kindly organized a presentation for me in Sherwood Park. In fact, that's the first time I met you, is when you did that. And if you remember, this is a long time ago, but think 6 years back, a lot of the stuff that I talked about in the book that I said it's coming is now here. Mm-hmm. And in 2016, 2017, my experts that I was interviewing in the US were saying, oh, we're going to see the inflection point for electric vehicles in 2032 or 2035. No, it came in like 2020, 2019. Caught everybody off guard because it was the Chinese manufacturers like BYD that drove that. So a lot of the things I talked about in that book that we assumed would take place in the 2030s are already here and have been here for a number of years now. So I often point to that book and say, I said that this stuff was coming because my experts said it. It's not like I'm a seer that looks into the future. My experts were saying this is coming, and a lot of it has come true already, but a lot quicker than we had expected.
Well, technology, just generally speaking, goes so much faster than we ever thought it would. So it's nothing new that way.
Well, my husband always has a little saying that he's used for a number of years now. When it comes to technology, a day is a week is a month is a year. That's literally how fast everything moves.
Yeah.
Well, I was around, we're all folks of a certain age. And I remember I was around in the 1990s and we started talking about internet time, right? Remember everything sped up because we could do it on the internet. And now we talk about China time. And I'll give you an example. It takes 4, 5, 6 years to design and put in place a new automobile model. The Chinese do it in 18 months. And so much of what we used to, our time frames are being compressed. There's a great graphic about, it's called the Sixth Industrial Revolution. So if you go back to the 18th century and the steam engine, Watt and the steam engine, that's the first industrial revolution. And then there have been successive ones after. But the thing that I want to point out, if we don't have the graphic here, but is that the time frame of each of those industrial revolutions is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And the one today is going to be the quickest yet. It'll only last maybe 15 or 20 years, and then we're going to be on to the next technological revolution.
Do
And
you
this
have
is,
a copy?
sorry, go
Sorry,
ahead.
do you have a copy of that picture?
I do someplace. I'll round it up for you.
Because if you send it to me, I will just insert it right here.
I will send it to you. I actually do have it on a slide. I'm pretty sure I can get my hands on it fairly quickly.
Awesome.
One of the points, and this is, I talk to Alberta audiences all the time about energy. And I make the point that we're now in a separate technological revolution, artificial intelligence, digital chemistry, materials. I mean, things are changing fast. Energy is a subset of that technology revolution. We're used to thinking, and Alberta has based its economy on energy as a commodity. Oil is a commodity. Gas is a commodity. Coal is a commodity. And what you have to do with those is first you burn it to turn it into energy, and then you use a device like an internal combustion engine or a furnace or a boiler, something like that. You use that to turn it into work. So, whether it's propelling your car or heating your home or whatever, that's the work. With electricity, you generate the electricity with the technology, and then you apply it directly to work. And solar panel, battery, and then it's in your EV and propelling your car. And the efficiencies that are gained are incredible. Like I have a heat pump in my house, and it's like 300 to 400% efficient. For every energy unit of energy that goes into the heat pump, I get 3 to 4 units of energy out of it. And ultimately, the oil and gas industry will tell you, I get this all the time. There's a wonderful graph that comes from Our World in Data. You can look for it Google it on the internet. And it shows it's from 1900 to 2024, and shows global primary energy demand. And it all just bumps along the bottom until 1945, when we really start industrializing in a big way. And then it just zooms up. It's just the scale of it is astonishing. It goes up by 6 or 8 times over the course of that period. And what's noticeable about this graph is it breaks it down into the percentage for each year in the graph of the various sources of energy. Mm-hmm. So it's going to be coal and oil and gas and hydro and nuclear and then renewables, in the last few years. And what the oil folks, because this comes from OPEC, say is that look at that 85 years. Every new source of energy was absorbed into a growing primary energy demand. It just was absorbed. So the favorite slogan is diversification, not displacement. We're going to have more energy, but we're not going to displace any. We're not going to push any out of the marketplace. The problem is that when you electrify something, you actually need more electricity, a lot more electricity, but you need less energy. So I interviewed Professor Nick Eyre from Oxford, who did a very well-known paper on this. And his estimate, he said, okay, hypothetically, if we could electrify the entire global economy and we had 435 exajoules of energy, when it's electrified, we would actually only need 245 exajoules of energy. I mean, I don't know if I've got the numbers right, but you can get the sense of the magnitude here. And you wouldn't have to be shipping. 40% of shipping is shipping coal, oil, and gas around the world. So you wouldn't need that. There's all sorts of efficiencies to be gained. That's the economy we're going to. We're not there yet, but we've made good progress already getting there. And the thing about, again, the Alberta leadership, because Albertans themselves, I think, have a better handle on this than the leadership. The leadership refuses to acknowledge what's going on in other countries. Like if you bring up China, what they say, first of all, oh yeah, China, it burns coal. Well, we can't take them seriously because they don't understand the Chinese power system. I interviewed experts and they say, look, what China's doing is it's going to add wind, solar, hydro, and nuclear. it's about 2050, 2060. It's going to have 100% or as close to it as they can get of clean electricity. And then all of their coal will be high efficiency coal, and it'll serve as backup.
Mm-hmm.
And so we think of gas in Alberta as backup. The Chinese think of it of coal as backup because they have lots of it. And so they don't have to import oil and gas anymore. They've electrified everything. So China is at the front. It's the first electric state. But Asia, big swaths of Latin America are all headed in the same direction.
So where does leadership get that position?
This is this is a sociological issue, because I have never met anybody in the oil and gas industry yet who can provide a data-based, evidence-based argument for their position. Now, and one of the things that I do as a journalist, I don't math, right? I mean, I was a history major in university. I don't math. But one of the things I can do is check the assumptions behind the math. So I read a lot of energy modeling, OPEC, ExxonMobil, Bloomberg NEF, the International Energy Agency, Rystad, S&P Global. They all put out these annual reports where they model where they think the energy system is going over the next 25 years. And the thing that I can do as a journalist that actually is I think it's a useful contribution to the conversation, is I go and I check the assumptions behind the modeling against what's happening in the real world. And so let me explain. OPEC assumes that between now and 2050, oil demand in the global north is going to decline, because we're going to electrify transportation, which is road transportation is 45% of global oil demand. We're going to electrify transportation, and our oil demand is going to drop quite a bit. So North America, Europe, China, Australia, Japan, South Korea. But in the global south, the rest of the world, oil demand is going to go up so high that not only will it offset the decline in North America, it will be more than that. So oil demand is going to grow from 103 million barrels a day today to 120 million barrels a day by 2050.
Why?
Because the emerging economies in India, the emerging economies in Pakistan, in Brazil, they want the same lifestyle that we have, and they want cars, and they want trucks, and OPEC assumes that by 2050, the global auto fleet is going to grow from 1.6 billion to 2.9 billion and be 75% gas powered and diesel powered. So I can check those assumptions. Well, their assumptions fall flat in their face, because what's happened is that when the Americans put up tariff barriers to Chinese electric vehicles, and Europe did the same, China went, okay, and they just pivoted over to the global south. And all of a sudden, now all you've got is China exporting oodles of electric vehicles into all of these countries I talked about, or continents I talked about, and it has no competition. And so if you're in India, now India is a bad example because they have their own EV industry. If you're in Brazil and you want a $9,000 electric vehicle that has all the bells and whistles, you can buy it because it was made in China. Their prices are incredibly cheap, and they're good vehicles. So China is in the process of essentially disrupting the global auto industry and taking it over and switching it over to electric. And at the same time, what's upstream of the auto industry? The oil industry. And so as the auto industry gets disrupted and the electrification accelerates, oil demand comes down. It peaks, and then it begins to decline. And so what we do here at Energy Media, we have a theory of change. And I've described most of it to you about the technology coming to the inflection point. But after you get in the inflection point, it might take 50 years to get the first 5% of market share. But once it's past the inflection point, the next 50% takes 5 years. You get exponential growth. And so during that time, you begin to disrupt industries, you begin to disrupt business models. Well, journalists can trace that disruption. We can do stories and do interviews about how, which legacy automakers are going to go bankrupt and which ones are losing market share in these different regions. And you can see the disruption in the data and in these interviews. And so that because the disruption is happening in the automobile industry and transportation, that it's only a matter of time before it gets to Alberta. And so we've traced out what we think, we call it the disruption chain, follow the disruption through the industries. And we think by the early 2030s, we're going to start seeing the big oil companies in Alberta, not all of them, but maybe one or two are going to be in financial trouble. And by 2035, we might even see Suncor, Cenovus, Imperial Oil, CNRL, one of those fail.
And I have a question around that, because one of the things I was thinking about as you were explaining the whole transition thing is that both of, Canada in general seems to be really pushing for these pipelines. Okay. Mm-hmm. Part of what is in the different platforms is how they're going to get it done really quick. And anyway, that's a whole different thing. It's not possible. But anyway, as you're talking about this transition in energy, I'm thinking to myself, are we going to invest all of this money into something that by the time it's actually ready will almost not be needed?
Well, you just sorry, Grace, I interrupted. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, well, the thing is that now I could be wrong, but it seems to me when they were talking about that during the debate last night, I don't think that Mark Carney actually said anything about pipelines east-west. He was talking about an energy corridor east-west.
Right.
He says it includes pipeline. He has said that it includes pipelines. Well,
he's been a little ambiguous about that. At one point he said, could be pipelines, but not necessarily pipelines. And then Danielle Smith got all up, lit her hair on fire as she is.
A Saudi prince.
Yeah. So, but here's the problem. What I've been saying to the pipeline advocates is, show me the math. Where are the customers? So let me give you the math. We produce in the oil sands ultra heavy sour crude, right? And it requires special cokers that are they're billions of dollars to outfit a refinery. So starting in the 80s and 90s, the Americans reconfigured 5.5 million barrels a day of refining capacity for our oil, for heavy crude oil. And out of at the global level, there's 10 million barrels a day of global, and that includes the Americans. So all together, there's 10 million barrels a day of refining capacity for heavy crude. So 5.5 million of them are in the United States. That means there's only 4.5 million in the rest of the world. And they have suppliers. I mean, Saudi Arabia and Iran and Brazil. And I mean, there are other countries that produce heavy oil. So does this mean that Alberta is just going to show up with a ship, a tanker full of heavy crude, and China will go, oh, let me write you a check? Where are the customers? Is Alberta crude competitive? Somebody ought to sharpen their pencil. And now I had Chris Reagan, who's a professor of economics at McGill, on my show today. And we were talking about this. And he said, well, it's not up to the government to make this decision. Let the private sector do it. And my response was, it has already been argued that the private sector doesn't want to build pipelines. There are no pipeline projects. They've said, we don't want to build oil pipelines. So if you want an oil pipeline, the government is going to have to come to the table and either de-risk it for the private sector, which means subsidize, or it's going to have to do like they did with Trans Mountain expansion and build it all themselves. So as soon as public money is involved in building a pipeline, now it's our business, right? Those are our tax dollars. And we should be able to say to these companies, show us the math. Because when I go have either of you ever been to your bank manager and you've gone in with a business loan, requesting a business loan, you bring in your business plan, you do your financial projections, and you have to, and what do you do? He sits there and he says, Markham, okay, what are the assumptions behind your financial projections? What are the risk factors of you not making those? What happens if, you assume you're going to make X amount of revenue? What happens if you don't? What happens if the economy goes into a recession? What happens if this? What happens if that? So if I want a $10,000 loan for my business in a bank manager, I get more due diligence than an oil company or a pipeline company that wants taxpayer dollars.
Yeah.
And I think that's ridiculous. We're like a bunch of lemmings. Donald Trump threatens us, and 3 months ago, and now all of a sudden somebody says, "Let's build pipelines," and the lemmings are all heading towards the cliff. Yeah. Let's all do pipelines, and nobody stops to say, "What's the math?"
Do you think it's possible that is Mark Carney's whole? Like, I mean, he has to be careful because he needs to get elected. Now, he doesn't really have to get elected by Alberta, but it's not politically great for him to come out and say, no, we don't need any pipelines.
Well, it's interesting. On March 19th, 14 oil and gas CEOs, 10 producers for pipeline companies, sent him a letter to all the political leaders, and they had a whole bunch of requests that change the regulations and so on and so forth. And they were very clear about what they wanted was not in response to Trump, because that's what I thought when I saw the letter. Oh, this is, they're saying we need to find new customers, right? Because we're going to lose some of our customers down in the U.S. It wasn't like that at all. What it said was, we think, now this was the subtext, this was not in the letter, but it was, we want to achieve our full potential as an industry. So when Danielle Smith talks about doubling oil production in Alberta, which would go from 4 million barrels a day to 8, what she's thinking is OPEC's projections. She's thinking there's 17 million barrels a day more demand in 2050 than there is today. Why can't Alberta have 4 of those? Why can't we become, if you add 4 to Canada's 5 in total, 9, now we're producing as much as Saudi Arabia and Russia. Mm-hmm. So if you're an Alberta oil and gas CEO and you have grand designs for the future, who, instead of being number 4, sort of the poor cousin number 4, you can play with the big boys. You're Russia, you're Putin and the Saudis, and that's where Alberta wants to go. And a lot of the anger, in my opinion, this is my take on it, a lot of the anger in Alberta now is because it is of those 4 producers, it's the only one that's landlocked. It's the only one that has to, in order to get its product out to a coast, out to a tidewater, has to go through another jurisdiction or jurisdictions if it goes east. And it's been frustrated. It's had projects canceled and what have you. And it resents that because these guys are masters of the universe. They want to be a big master of the universe, and they feel like the Liberal government and other governments like BC are consigning them to being little masters of the universe. And they don't like that, and they're angry about it, and they're kind of bitter. And now, does that not accurately reflect the attitude that you see in Alberta on a regular basis, and reflect the anger and bitterness that you see in the conversation around oil and gas? So,
well, I think there's anger and bitterness. There's resentment. There is, dare I say it, a healthy dose of ignorance. And I mean ignorance in the we don't know, as opposed to being just an ignorant person.
Yeah.
Because it is very, I mean, if you've worked on the rigs all your life, you've raised your family, that's what you know. For somebody to come along and say, yeah, well, it's going to be electricity. And how many times I've heard people say, well, they've obviously never lived in Alberta in the winter if they think they're going to have an electric car, because we're so stuck in the way we think that because it will always be.
That was my point about the primary energy demand graph. They think the next 75 years are going to be just like the last 75 years. The energy future will look just like the energy past. Now, I get that argument all the time, right? From oil bureaus, I call them. And the argument, my reply is, your customers are not living in Alberta. You're an export industry. Your customers are in Chicago and Detroit and Houston and in Rocky Mountains, in Denver, in California. Those are places that have lots of electric cars and are going to have a lot more. You want to go to China with your oil. You want to go to Asia. You want to go to Europe. Those are places that are electrifying the transportation like crazy.
Yeah.
So if you think the world looks like Alberta, your customers live somewhere where electric transportation is extremely viable.
So the answer to are we too late with the pipelines is probably yes.
Here's the thing. Giving a definitive answer to what's going to happen in the energy future is very difficult. So what I've been arguing for a long time is, well, here I am talking to two mothers. I call it Mom's maxim. Mom always says, hope for the best, plan for the worst. What does Alberta do? It plans for the best and simply pretends the worst doesn't exist.
Blames Trudeau if it doesn't happen.
Yeah. So what I'm arguing for is, let's have a different energy conversation where we actually address the worst case scenario. It's a risk factor, right? So if you're planning a project, like if you're an engineer and you're looking at this project, you go, what are the risks? What are my risks? Is it a geological risk? Is it an economic risk? Is it a market risk? What kind of a risk is it? Regulatory risk, maybe? Well, this is a market risk. This is the risk here is that global markets, including the ones we already have, are set to decline within the next 10 years. Mm-hmm. How big a problem is that for the Alberta industry if that eventuality happens? Before we spend tens of billions of dollars of taxpayer dollars, we should have an answer to that question. Yeah. So we can adequately gauge the risk. Okay, we can say, are we comfortable with this level of risk? Or aren't we comfortable with this level of risk? Right now, we're a bunch of lemmings. We're not asking those questions.
Yeah. You had, going back to, and just interrupt, Grace, because I'm kind of dominating the questions, but they're all whirling around in my head. Going back to when you talked about interconnecting the electrical grid around Canada, how expensive would that be to do? Do you know?
Very expensive. And that's one of the reasons why the federal government has to come to the table. Mm-hmm. Is because building this transmission infrastructure is not cheap. Now, having said that, the Alberta Electric System Operator, AESO, a few years ago did a study where they said they were focused on net zero, right? So how can Alberta get to net zero, their power grid get to net zero? And they estimated that to do that would cost between 44 billion and 54 billion, 42 and 54 billion. The reason I bring that up is because they said the private sector will pay 90% of the cost. Why? Because utilities love selling more electricity. And so if they have to invest in the infrastructure to sell that electricity, they'll recover those costs over time from their customers. And so it's not like if we say that it's going to take $54 billion to build all this transmission infrastructure and build the new generating capacity and yada, 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 that doesn't mean the taxpayer has to pay for it. The taxpayer may pay part of it because it's an investment in the infrastructure of the Alberta economy, but it doesn't have to pay all of it. So the federal government has said, we will come to the table with the big red checkbook and we will help pay for those interties.
Mm-hmm. Did you have any questions, Grace?
Well, I think the only thing that I have to wonder is, okay, so going back to what I said earlier about like the fact that Mark Carney, he didn't talk about, yes, he sort of talked about pipelines going east-west, but what he referred to was that energy corridor. Now, the thing is that, and then you, of course, we're talking about how the fiefdoms in Alberta, they want to be the big guys, the big fish, and now they're the little fish, and now they're pissed off at everybody beside them because they can't get the product to Tidewater. So I guess where I'm going with that, so like for whatever stupid reason, the oil bros, as you call them, completely ignore the fact that the Trudeau government built the TMX. The Trudeau government built that pipeline through BC. Even though BC fought it tooth and nail, they got it done. But they prefer to ignore that. So why are the big oil CEOs not going to the Alberta government to say, build us a pipeline? Why are they focusing strictly on the federal government building those pipelines?
Okay, so in the Canadian system, anything that happens within a province is under the purview of the provincial regulator, which in Alberta is the Alberta Energy Regulator. So if you, like Brett Wilson builds pipelines to connect his wells and stuff, all of that gets approved by the AER. The moment you propose a pipeline that crosses a provincial border, now it becomes federal responsibility. And one of the this is an issue that I debated Chris Reagan about this morning, because the argument is made in Alberta that the federal government didn't do enough for Trans Mountain expansion, and that's why Kinder Morgan. You know what? I reported on that, and it was completely misunderstood in Alberta. So let me explain this. Under the NEB Act, National Energy Board, that's the federal regulator, the legislation that enables it specifically delegates the federal government's power, the authority, over to this arm's length entity, the National Energy Board. So the National Energy Board regulates the industry independently on behalf of the federal government. So it would be totally inappropriate for the federal government to come along and interfere in the actions of the NEB. You can't do that. The regulator has to be kept at arm's length from the government. And so what happened was the city of Burnaby absolutely hounded Kinder Morgan. They wouldn't issue permits in a timely fashion. They did everything they could to make it awful for Kinder Morgan. And I read the correspondence between the two. And I read the NEB would actually ruled on 2 occasions that the federal government has paramountcy. Now, what that means, paramountcy, is that when there's a conflict between the federal government and the provincial government, the federal jurisdiction is paramount. And so they said very clearly, the NEB did, the federal government has exclusive jurisdiction to regulate interprovincial pipelines. So if the federal government says that it's going through Burnaby, it's goddamn well going through Burnaby. And so the NEB, and this is the point I made to Professor Reagan, I said the process worked exactly as it was designed to work. What Burnaby did is figure out how to game the process. The villain here is Burnaby. If you're an Albertan looking at Trans Mountain expansion, the villain is Burnaby. It's not the federal government, and also the government of BC, because the government of BC and Burnaby sued the Trans Mountain, and then it had to go to court, and all of that leads to delays, right? So the anger here is misplaced. The process worked as it was designed to work.
I don't want to lose. There's something I don't want to lose, and that is going back, and it ties in with this whole business of interprovincial and pipelines being built and stuff like that. Because there was a letter that was sent out to all of the leaders from the oil and gas industry saying, this is what we would like you to do. Will you do it? Polyev has said, yep. In fact, I've got a quote here. It says, Canada's energy sector, the experts on energy growth, not sure how that, but anyway, have told us what we need to do. Today, I am committing to meeting all of their urgent recommendations. But part of what he was agreeing to in that letter, it says, by declaring a Canadian energy crisis and key projects in the national interest, the federal government will be able to use, and this is, they bolded, all of its available emergency powers to ensure that the dramatic regulatory restructuring required to expand the oil and natural gas sector is rapidly achieved. So in essence, they have agreed that, yeah, if we need to, we could, and I know it's not called this anymore, but we could bring in the War Measures Act and get this done. They've also said that they're going to get everything done, all the approvals and stuff, in 6 months.
That's what they're demanding. Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. So, and Polyev has agreed to it. It takes longer than that to come up with the engagement that would need, like, just to design the engagement that would need to be done with Indigenous communities.
Right. Well, there's about three things happening here, and one of them is that the declare an energy crisis. That's a Trump thing. That has no standing in law, in Canadian law. It means nothing. And then there's the declaration of a project in the national interest. And this was, you remember back in, when Jason Kenney was premier, and they were on and on about this. Why isn't Trudeau declaring things in the national interest? Because the law does not require him to. He said it in public. He said this TMX is in the national interest, and that's why we're going to go ahead and we're going to build this at taxpayers' expense. But there is no requirement in the law for a project to be declared in the national interest to speed it up or anything like that. Then there's the issue of what the letter actually said was to use all available emergency powers. Now, all available absolutely means the Emergency Act. There's no way you can put another construction on that. And when I did the energy show about this letter, probably about March 20th or 21st, I lit my hair on fire. Because as much as even back in the day when I argued in favor of Trans Mountain expansion in front of the project, I always argued that opponents dissent cannot be stifled. You can't use the power of the state to oppress Canadians who disagree with you. So just because it's inconvenient for you and it might add some cost to your project and might slow you down, too bad. That's the way a democracy works. So now when I see the oil industry saying, we want you to use the Emergency Act, which we used to declare an emergency in the pandemic in 2020 when we had COVID-19 pandemic. We used it to clear out the occupiers in 2022 out of the convoy, the Freedom Crowd. We use it in the case of a hurricane or a war. I mean, that's what it's meant for. It doesn't get used very often. So to use it,
9/11.
I believe we did, but I'm not entirely certain about that.
Off track, sorry.
But 9/11, a pipeline is not 9/11. It's not an attack on your country or your ally that's next door. So the idea of using the emergency powers of the state, the federal state, to suppress Canadians' ability to dissent is abhorrent in a democracy. I can't find words strong enough to say how much I disagree with that idea. And I was disappointed yesterday because Mark Carney, he had not quite the same strong language, but he indicated that he would support the use of emergency powers around pipelines. And I think Canadians should be outraged. And it really bothers me when I hear Albertans who, from the oil industry going, oh yeah, well, why, of course we do it. It's a pipeline. It's a good project. No, we should stand on principle. This is one you don't back down with if you believe in democracy.
It's kind of like the whole taking illegal alien, or sorry, let me retract that. That is like taking foreigners and sending them off to an El Salvador. Thank you. Prison because, it's not real Americans.
Yeah, it's not us. It's somebody else.
Yet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I mean, I must admit, so where my brain was, I have certain arguments against whether, given the actions of the UCP here in Alberta, just how democratic is this province? So of course they'd be fine with stomping on people's right to dissent and stuff like that.
Had a thought in the train. Train of thought left the station. But I don't want to comment on the UCP in Alberta because I'm not my beat isn't the law courts I'm not a lawyer. But what I will say is that under the Canadian Constitution, Section 35, all projects like this are required. They require Aboriginal consultation.
Yes.
And there is absolutely no way that you could do a pipeline consultation with Indigenous communities along that pipeline route and do it in 6 months. It is literally an impossibility, and to do it properly. And so on that issue alone, that argument fails. Never mind there are plenty of other arguments, but on that issue, it's in the Constitution. You can't do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And as somebody who has in communications been involved in consultation, it would probably take for a project of that size would probably take a good 6 months just to plan to undergo it.
Yeah.
And not to do it, just to put the plan together. Yeah,
this is to do this kind of work well and properly is a highly technical process. And while I appreciate, I should mention, here's another thing. When all of this kerfluffle came up around Trans Mountain expansion, I went down and I found a couple of legal scholars at the University of Houston. And I said, well, what's it like down in the United States? Well, they said it's exactly the same. They have a federal legislation called NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act. And under that act, anytime a pipeline or any kind of infrastructure goes across borders, if it's like an environmental group or a tribe or a town thinks that the regulations were not followed, they can sue under NEPA. And so what's happening is the environmental groups in particular got very, very good at using NEPA as a legal tool to take the project to court and drag it out and drag it out and drag it out. So this idea that somehow down in the United States, there's a magic wand that just makes pipelines grow over interstate borders is just absolutely false. It just doesn't happen. Now, inside of Texas, absolutely. The Railroad Commission, which is their regulator, will approve pipelines east, north, and west, just like Pierre Poilievre says, and that's fine. That's within their authority to do it. But when you cross borders and you get into other jurisdictions, that's a whole different matter.
Some of the things that the Conservatives have said is that they're going to repeal C-69 along with Bill C-48, lift the cap on Canadian energy, and scrap the industrial carbon tax. Thoughts?
I have many. And I've dealt with these in detail over the last week or so on the Energy Show. So you can go to our YouTube channel, Energy Media YouTube channel, find the playlist for the Energy Show, and you'll see the title as you can pick out the ones that deal with these issues. So in short, I interviewed on the C-69, which is actually irrelevant because that's the bill. It was passed. We don't talk about it anymore. It's the Impact Assessment Act. That's what they're talking about. And I interviewed Professor Sean Fluker, who's a law scholar at the University of Calgary, and he said the narrative around the Impact Act doesn't match the reality. Yes, there are some new provisions in the act that are a little tougher than they were under the act that Stephen Harper, the Conservative Prime Minister, brought in 2012. He said, but there is nothing in here that would prevent a pipeline from being built. It's not what its opponents say. It's not the No More Pipelines Act. That's his opinion. You can see my interview with him. He explains it in detail. On the industrial emitters carbon tax, I go into great length describing negotiations that took place in 2014, 2015 between 5 oil sands CEOs and 5 environmental group executive directors beginning in Calgary, where they came to a handshake agreement on carbon pricing. And the oil sands companies, and I have this, I don't know how many interviews I did where oil industry people and Dave Collier from CAP and so on said, our industry in the future needs to be cost and carbon competitive. We need to get our emissions down. We know we need the carbon tax. And I asked Harbir Sheena, who was the VP of technology for Cenovus, well, why don't you just do it if it's such a good idea? He said, in a competitive environment like the oil industry here in Alberta, he said, who's going to be the first? Which management team is going to go out and impose extra costs on their production and be the first, and then explain that to their board of directors, to their shareholders? He said, it's never going to happen. He said,
so they need a bad guy. They need a bad guy in the government.
He said, we need the government to impose it on us. He said, that's what we want, is the government to set this in place. And the Notley, the NDP premier, Rachel Notley, brought it in 2015. It's called the CCIR. And the industry loved it at the time, thought it was a great thing. And then when Kenny became premier, he changed it to TIER, T-I-E-R, diluted its effect. But what Danielle Smith has done, and this is the point I made, it's really important. The way that it's constructed, there's a carbon market, a credit market. So if credits are created that you can buy, so that if you can't meet your emissions targets, you buy these credits instead. And what they've done is they flooded the market with credits and basically driven their costs down. Now, Europe did this with their carbon market for a long time until they finally fixed it. What that means is you say, oh, we have an $85 a megaton carbon tax for industrial emitters in Alberta. No, you don't, because the credits are so cheap that actually reduces the cost of the carbon tax down to almost a very minor amount. And I'll give you an example. Suncor said in its investor presentation last year that it pays 47 cents a barrel on average for the carbon tax. And looking out 10 years, it would pay $1.70. Does that sound inhibitive? Does that sound like it's going to break anybody?
Nope.
So from my point of view, what's happened is very quietly and through a technical mechanism, the Smith government has very quietly basically hamstringed the industrial emitters carbon tax, so it doesn't work anyway.
Yeah.
Oh, I wish we had another hour.
Everybody's surprised, right?
Yeah. Mm.
So, okay, just to wrap this up, what Pierre Poilievre did was essentially say and put his good housekeeping stamp of approval on the ambition of the Alberta oil and gas industry to do what Danielle Smith says, which is double oil production, because their ambition is to be like Russia and Saudi Arabia in the global oil market. And here's an interesting little point. So we talked about the Emergency Act. I went and read the Emergency Act, and there is a provision in the, it says how do you define an emergency? And then it gives you all of the examples and, this, that, and the other thing. And there's one clause, little sentence fragment at the very end that says, or an economic interruption of resources. And they could have come and they could have said, our lawyers have said that the Emergency Act applies in this case because it interrupts the Canadian economy, and the export of our oil to the United States is going to be interrupted, and there's going to be a cost, and it's going to hurt people. People will get laid off, yada, yada, yada. You put the argument together and you hang it on that hook in the Emergency Act. They didn't do that. They didn't do that. What they said was, we want all of this so that we can realize the full potential of our industry. So what they're saying is, I'll paraphrase it, is I'm prepared to suppress the democratic rights of Canadians because I want to sell more oil on the global market. And to me, that is unacceptable.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
There's a few other things under the Conservative one-stop shopping, et cetera, et cetera. Upgrade the Port of Churchill to open another door to export Canadian resources to the world. Rapidly approve phase 2 of the LNG Canada to the project's double gas production and accelerate at least 9 other projects currently snarled in liberal red tape.
Well, let's deal with a couple of those. One is open up the Port of Churchill. I grew up in the 70s in a little town called Gillam, which is south of Churchill on the Bay Line. That's the first hydro dam, Manitoba Hydro Dam. My dad worked there, and then I even worked for Hydro after high school. And I rode that train between Churchill and Thompson. Oh, I don't know how many dozens of times I during the 70s when I was a kid. It's like this through the permafrost. And back then it had 30-mile-an-hour limits on it. And there were what they called landings, right? The track would break and the train would get derailed and you'd have a big, cars would be all in the muskeg and it was a mess. You're going to ship millions of barrels or hundreds of thousands of barrels a day of oil over that permafrost? Good luck. Good luck building a pipeline up there. It's an enormous engineering challenge. So that's a very difficult thing. I'm not saying it couldn't be done. There are clever engineers. Maybe they can figure out how to do it. But it's not a panacea. It's not an easy fix for this particular problem. What were some of the other things that you mentioned?
Let me just bring it up. The one-stop shopping.
One-stop shopping. That's actually a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens is the provinces do an environmental review. And in the case of a pipeline, you could have every province along the route of the pipeline doing an environmental review. Then the regulator, which is now called the Canadian Energy Regulator, does its review. And that's quite right. I mean, that does need to be streamlined. So what they're talking about, what Carney's talking about, is that there would be an agreement between the provinces where they would agree that there's only one review. And who would do it? Well, probably the Canadian Energy Regulator, and the provinces would sign off on, yes, our requirements were met under our law. It satisfies us. So the company only has to deal with one. And that's not a bad idea. I think that has merit. So yeah. That's a good one.
Yeah. LNG, phase 2 of LNG.
I went into World Energy, the International Energy Agency's World Energy Outlook 2024, right, which came out last October. It is the flagship for energy modeling and energy analysis of all of the various agencies that do this kind of work. And in that, there is a graph on page 179, if you want to go and look at it. I think it's figure 3.7. And it shows the LNG supply and LNG demand out to 2050. And you know what it shows? There's so much supply coming on from Qatar and from the United States and from other places. Mozambique, I think, has got a bunch coming on, that there's actually until 2040, even in the worst case scenario, there's an oversupply for the next 15 years out to 2040. And then that's the worst case scenario. Like when I say that, that's the business as usual case. It's called STEPS. And then the next one, which is the APS, shows a rapid decline after 2030. And then net zero one, of course, shows a very rapid decline. So my response always to the LNG folks is, where's the beef? Like you say you want to get all these LNG projects going up. Here's the modeling that shows that in fact there's going to be too much LNG in the world, in global markets. Yeah. So, what are we going to do? Are we going to outcompete them? Well, we're not. West Coast LNG is not competitive because we have very high capital costs. Now, because we don't have the big infrastructure like Louisiana and Texas do, or Qatar does. We're building out in the wilderness, basically, on the west coast of British Columbia. It's very expensive. Now, on the other hand, LNG does, the costs are lower in a cold climate. So the cool climate in Northwest BC does lower operating costs. But when you take and we're not all in agreement on this, but the folks that I interview, like at Pembina Institute, say the higher capital costs still override the lower operating costs, and so Western Canadian LNG is not a low cost producer. We're a high cost producer. We're not that competitive. So if you had a shortage of LNG and prices were always going to be high, then you could say, well, yeah, sure, Canadian LNG could compete. But they would argue that no, that's not going to be the case. There's going to be an oversupply, prices will be low, and that we're just not competitive. So now let me ask you ladies something. Does anybody in Alberta ever point that out? Do you ever see it in the Calgary Herald? Do you ever see it reflected in the press releases? Do you ever see it reflected in anybody's comments?
No, and it's frustrating for me because, like, as I'm listening to you, it makes sense to me, and I just don't understand why people get so wrapped up in the ideology of it all. Because to me, Alberta would be better off if we followed the Markham Hislop
Make me energy
platform.
minister, I'll fix everything.
Yeah, exactly. Like it makes so much sense.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I think it makes sense too, but you do have to consider though that the culture here in Alberta. I mean, we may as well call it "Make Alberta Great Again," because that's all they're concerned about. They're not concerned about anything else, and so they're willing to ignore the good sense because it doesn't match with their mindset.
That is very true. I mean, I made the point earlier, and I'll make it again. I have never met anybody in Alberta that can mount a evidence and data based argument in favor of more oil and gas expansion. The level of their analysis is about what you would get sipping scotch in the Calgary Petroleum Club, or Tim Hortons in anywhere in Alberta. I mean, I can go into the OPEC or the ExxonMobil modeling, and I can make that argument. I can make their argument for them. And then I can go over here and make the argument against them. I feel like a lawyer. I can argue both sides of the case because I've read the bloody studies. Now, they're going to say, which here's hilarious. Danielle Smith gets on about the International Energy Agency and it's a political organization doing all of these computer simulations. What do you think the OPEC modelers used? They didn't use abacuses. They didn't use calculators. They used computer models. I mean, come on, people. That's the level of conversation we're talking about here.
Yeah.
What we need is a more sophisticated discussion because the arguments that I've given you tonight have counter arguments.
Mm-hmm.
They're not perfect. Here's the modeling, here's the trends, something could happen.
Yeah.
Or maybe there's something we haven't considered yet in this argument. But if we sit down, because we're talking tens of billions, maybe hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayers' dollars, we deserve to do the due diligence to protect that money. And if after doing the due diligence, we say, you know what, the preponderance of evidence favors building the pipeline, build the pipeline. That's great. I'm fine with that. If we consider all of the sides of the argument, not just the pro pipeline argument.
But unfortunately, in this TikTok world, I think the reason why we're ending up in situations like they are in the south of us in the States, and I don't mean to, make it sound like it's simple or anything, but arguments that sound rational on a very limited scale appeal to people. People aren't interested in taking that deep dive and having that fulsome conversation. And that allows people like Pierre Poilievre to come forward and say, we're going to put it through in 6 months without any thought to how on earth would you do that and still adhere to the Constitution to have those Indigenous consultations. Just like Danielle Smith saying, let's separate. And you take a look at a map, almost all of Alberta is covered by treaty land.
Yeah.
treaties that were formed by the federal government, and those treaty bearers are under they haven't signed a treaty with Alberta. They've signed it with the federal government. So they don't have to come with us. So we could end up with the, 2 miles square is Alberta's the independent country.
Yeah.
Like, think about this, people.
The problem is that we've entered an era of populism, and populism is like simple solutions. And the whole idea behind populism is that you find an enemy, right? And then you rage bait, and you get the populace, the voters, angry at the other group. In this case, the federal government, right? 5 years ago, 10 years ago was BC, because BC didn't want to build the Trans Mountain expansion. Now it's the federal Liberals and Trudeau. But you know what? I had today, when I was interviewing Chris Reagan, I brought up some Angus Reid polling. And what it said was, they asked the question is, of all provinces, would you want to separate? And Alberta said 25% would. But if the Liberals win, then it would go up to 30%. Big deal. That's not anywhere close to a majority.
Exactly.
And you could argue that a lot of that sentiment is out in rural Alberta.
Yeah.
Right. It's not in Edmonton. It's not in Calgary. It's not in Lethbridge. It's not in places like that. It's out in rural Alberta. So it doesn't reflect the opinions of all Albertans.
Yeah. Well, and one thing that I learned when I spent 4 years on council at Strathcona County is that for every complex problem, there is a simple, common sense solution that is wrong. And I said this to somebody once, and they were nodding their head, agreeing, until I got to the part where I said it's wrong. And they're like, "What are you talking about?" And I said, we are so caught up in this common sense that we don't stop to think. So, for example, when I was on council, I'm just as bad as anybody else. I went on to council thinking, well, it just makes sense. You just have to do this. It just makes sense. It's common sense. But when you get in there and you start realizing that, oh, wait a minute, if you do this, it affects that, which affects this. And maybe it's not such a simple solution after all. But
nobody wants complexity anymore. And it's one of the reasons why in our journalism, we haven't become, like the Western Standard or the Rebel Media, is because that's what they do. They rage bait, and they offer simple solutions and make people angry. Well, that's the easy thing to do. I don't want to make people angry. I want people to think.
Yeah.
I want to present them evidence, and here's a graph from the IEA, or here's a graph from OPEC. Let's have a talk about that. And then what do we say about it? What do we think about that? That's the kind of journalism that I want to do. And these days, not a lot of people want to have that conversation, and I get that. But the interesting thing is, now that we're doing the energy show, there's a lot more people that are tuning in, and Trump has a lot to do with that, because now people are looking for smart ideas, and there aren't a lot. There just aren't a lot. And so, a friend of mine who has gone to some of the liberal federal government events where they talk about this stuff, he said under Trudeau, the Liberals were just searching around for solutions. Have you got a solution? You got a policy? You got a strategy? You got this? You got that? There is a paucity of ideas. And when I was doing my graduate work 40 years ago at the University of Saskatchewan, I took a historiography class, the study of historians. And I got Arnold Toynbee, who wrote a book called The Study of History. It's 11 volumes. It's like this. Thing's massive. But here's the thing that I took away from that. Toynbee, who did like a study of all of human history, that's the scale at which he worked, he said, civilizations rise and fall on the quality of their leadership. If the civilization is confronted with an existential crisis and the leadership does not rise to the occasion, the civilization will begin to decline.
Has the U.S. Congress heard that?
No. But here's the thing. Here's the other part of it. to wrap it up, if the leadership does respond well to the existential crisis, then the civilization actually begins to rise again. And so the quality of leadership is absolutely essential. And I would argue, and I've been arguing for a while, that the quality of leadership in Alberta is abysmal. And it's not just at the provincial government. It's in the oil and gas industry, in the business community. There's the ability to actually analyze a situation and come up with a coherent argument is just pathetic. But it's not great at the federal level either, because the Trudeau government looked at everything through a climate lens. And if you notice, I haven't mentioned climate at all. And we've been doing this for an hour and 15 minutes, and I haven't talked about climate change, because clean energy technologies, because they are past their inflection point, we are going to have an electric economy. It's inevitable. The only question now is how fast. That's the only question. Electric is going to triumph over fossil fuels.
And are we going to be ready for it?
And are we going to be ready? Are we going to get left behind, or are we going to adapt? And I want to, and I'll put in a little plug here. I should have done this earlier in the show, but maybe when maybe you can include the website. Energy Media launched 2 weeks ago, a campaign called Canada 2050. And the website is canada-2050.com. And we proposed a 3-point strategy. So the first one is add value to natural resources. Stop sending raw resources like oil and gas, like round logs, like minerals, like grains, all of that. Stop sending raw stuff. Process it, or at the very least, semi-process it here. That's the best way to create a Trump-proof economy, is add value and build out our industry with our own natural resources. Number 2, electrify. We've talked about this already. Don't have to go over it again. Number 3, build all the infrastructure required to do points 1 and 2. So means
that's your platform.
That's the platform right there.
Yeah.
And the reason we did this is because you would think that there are smart economists all over the place that have, promoting ideas. Nada. So we said, we're going to step up, and we will try to provide that leadership that I just talked about by presenting this campaign. We're asking people 3 things: sign the petition, share the website and the video content that we create, ask your network to share it as well. And if everybody does that, we're trying to build a grassroots movement for this simple strategy to build a different Canadian economy.
Do you think Mark Carney is one of those good economists or not?
Yes. And I did an energy show about this, and I got a University of Toronto economist, Tom Kemeny, to come on and talk to me. What Mark Carney said, so there's a genre of economics called economic development theory. And part of that, and the reason I know this, not because I'm an economist, but 30 years ago, the firm I was working for, I supervised a team of economists who did an economic development strategy for a Western Canadian utility that shall go unnamed to protect the guilty. And what the economists told me, they said, look, here's the basics. You have a sector like oil, like gas, like agriculture, like forestry, and you look for 3 things. You look for the backward linkages, which are the inputs into that industry. You look for the forward linkages, where you take the output of that industry and you add more value to it. So you take oil and you refine it. And the backward linkage would be services, like well servicing or something. Mm-hmm. And the third thing is technology linkage. So you look for technologies that are developed in the industry that could be commercialized in other sectors, or you look for industry or technologies that could be added to the sector to make it more efficient and increase labor productivity. And what Mark Carney did is, it was almost like a throwaway line. He was in a press conference and he said to a reporter, he said, this is kind of a nerdy thing, but we're going to do backward linkages from the auto sector, and that's how we're going to build a Canadian data. And I went, oh my God, the man speaks in full paragraphs. He actually does. I couldn't believe it. And so we went over to Kemeny and I went over what we could, if you took Carney's basic concept of these three linkages and you applied it to the various various sectors of the Canadian economy, you have a strategy.
Yeah.
You actually have you have a rational strategy that's grounded in economic theory. And we know how to do this stuff.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So all that said then, so aside from the fact that Carney said yesterday that he would consider the Emergencies Act for pipelines, of the two parties, which platform is closest to your ideal?
Well, it would have to be the Liberal one, because basically the conservative.
I figured as much.
Well, no, I have a rational explanation for why that is. If you look at from my point of view, where the global energy system is being transformed by clean energy technologies, and we're moving to an electric economy over time, then Carney's idea of building out the Canadian electricity system, expanding it, continuing to make it clean and all of it, that's like a game changer right there. And all Poilievre has done at this point is to say, this is what the oil and gas executives want, I'll give it to them. That's not an energy platform. I mean, I'm sorry. If Poilievre had come up with the idea that Carney had, I'd be all over that. I would support it. This is not a partisan thing. It's that Carney's ideas are better when it comes to energy.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
Well, that works. That works. Okay. Well, I'd say we covered a lot of information tonight. Like,
holy crow.
Oh, we're just scratching the surface. Go to the Energy Show and on the Energy Media channel, and you can drown yourself in information. There's a lot of it.
For somebody who wants to really take that extra deep dive and really learn everything there is to know.
Fall down the rabbit hole. Please fall down the rabbit hole.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Markham. This has been awesome, and I've really enjoyed it. I've learned lots, and my brain hurts. And
well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate this, and good luck with. I know you just started your podcast, and I know what that's like because we did it. It started Energy Talks in 2022, and go for it. I encourage you to keep doing it. This is, turn it into an interesting show. I'm sure you will.
Yep.
We're going to try.
Yep, we are.
Okay.
All righty then.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Good night, Markham.